But my philosophy is very simple. When you see something that is not right, not fair, not just, say something, do something, get in trouble, good trouble, necessary trouble.
Strength and solidarity. The strength and solidarity. Divided is our nation, combating and fighting hatred. The mission, should you choose to accept it, is fighting racist psychology. Is just a space where we run in our simulations. We load you up with the tools, then we plug you into the matrix. So have a seat on the couch, now tell me your situation. Take a look in the mirror, be honest, just who you facing. Marginalized as a youth, what challenges were you faced with? Feeling you wasn't equal, told that you wouldn't make it. Your ID isn't real, got you constantly trying to fake it. Hiding behind masks in the closet till you can't take it. Getting harder to breathe, someone choking you on the pavement. Unspeakable violence attacking you cause you Asian. Accomplices we accomplish through collaboration, engaging, educating, evaluating one another, liberating the future of all our sisters and brothers, empowering, elevating all communities of color. Strength and solidarity. The strength and solidarity.
The Strength and Solidarity podcast is a conversational piece that invites scholars, community activists, leaders, artists, and entrepreneurs to discuss their work as accomplices in cultivating cross-racial ethnic solidarity. Hosted and produced by Pooja Mami Dana and Dr. Dana Demanari, our podcast team also includes our podcast interns, Alexis Rios and Petra Zadroga. The Strength and Solidarity podcast strives to engage, educate, evaluate, and empower communities of color, one episode at a time. Welcome to the season finale episode of Season 2 of the Strength and Solidarity podcast.
Miranda Encina is a two-spirit queer Xicanx born and raised in Boulder, Colorado with indigenous roots from Apache and Navajo ancestry. Miranda graduated Summa Cum Laude from the University of Colorado Boulder, double majoring in Ethnic Studies and Sociology. Their research focused on intergenerational resistance and complex trauma within Xicana/indigenous communities. Miranda's passion is to center lived experiences of those with intersecting identities through connections and knowledge sharing on individual, collective, and systematic levels. Miranda's lived and professional experience include trauma-informed, survivor-defined advocacy, volunteer and intern management, shelter program director, chair of Queer Trans People of Color Leadership Cohort, facilitation of Indigenous Healing Circles, child protective services, training and technical assistant on intersections of oppression and domestic violence, and has experience as a court-appointed special advocate. Miranda collaborates with community and system-based organizations on all levels to identify, create, and implement shifts that validate, humanize, and minimize re-traumatization within our communities. Miranda's experience with healing personally and in community prompted the start of Yolia Creations. Yolia Creations is rooted in providing unique handcrafted leather earrings, sterling silver necklaces, inspirational stamped bracelets/rings, and art that centers healing, existence, and connection. Yolia Creation signifies a connection that we are stronger as a community when we support each other and create connections to empower, resist, and exist.
Hi, Miranda. Thank you so much for being here on our podcast today with Dr. Donna and I, Strength and Solidarity. We are so excited to have you here with us today.
Hi, welcome. Thank you for having me.
Oh my gosh, it's such an honor, and I'm super excited to have you here today. I'm just giddy with excitement, so I'm going to try to control myself.
No worries. Excitement is welcome in this space. Thank you all for having me so much. I really appreciate being here. It really is truly an honor to share space with you all.
Well, it's an honor for us, and you don't need to thank us. And we've been looking forward to having this conversation. So we'd like to begin by You have a really rich, multicultural, diverse background. And could you share more about how your Indigenous heritage and intersectional identities have influenced your personal journey and your passion and advocacy for your community work?
Absolutely. So I'll begin by doing a little introduction of myself. So I'm Miranda. I use they and she pronouns. I currently reside in Colorado, which is the Arapaho Cheyenne Ute nations and land. And again, so thank you all so much for having me here. I also have my notes, just so you know, in case I'm looking around.
No, you don't. Please.
You honestly, I am very bad with following that. So, and Pooja knows this about me. I am so intent on the conversation that I am all over the place. So,
Well, good. I appreciate the space for that. So as far as, my background and my diversity and intersectionality and identities and kind of how that's played into my personal journey, it really has shaped so much of it, right? I mean, my lived experience as somebody who exists in the current place that I'm in, the location that I'm in, but also, the lives that I've had and in my connections and my relationships and my understanding of the world and experience really has just kind of shaped where I've gone. It's funny because I talk to people on like a day-to-day basis, and it's hard oftentimes to explain what's in my head because I'm such like a visual. The way that I've learned has been in Indigenous ceremony and Indigenous practices. And so my thoughts are very fluid and visual. And I find that in our society, most people don't think like that, right?
Yeah.
So then having to kind of relay what that means for me and what that has been on my journey really is one of, experience and connectivity and ebb and flow and really, who I am has shifted where I've gone, right?
Yeah.
And what that has been like for me. And so there's a quote that I have been really kind of sticking with me recently that someone had told me. And the quote is, when you know who you are, you know what to do. Right. And so I've really kind of held that very sacredly in my journey. And so, location wise, my family is a very activist family and has always been a very activist family. So it really kind of shapes who I am. Right. And the reason why I am in this location, I'm currently in Broomfield, Colorado, so close to Boulder, which is a really big university town. But my family, my mom's side of the family, my matriarchal side of the family, lived in a small town a little bit outside, a few hours away from where I currently am. But the reason why my grandma came up this way was because she wanted to go to college. And this wasn't very long ago, right? This is the 60s. She wanted to go to college at CU, but CU didn't allow Black and brown students at the time. And so my family moved this way to really be able to go to school and to fight in that fight for, education and community and all of those pieces. And so that's why I'm here, right? So removing myself from the context of, my family and our history and our location and our traveling is impossible, right? Because that really shaped who I am. I was a part very, very young age. We were a part of like these really big movements and marches and strikes and like all of these things, right? We were really immersed in the HIV/AIDS pandemic and did a lot of advocacy in those. So that shaped kind of my drive to be in advocacy and my passion to be in community and really a lot of the work that I currently do today. And then again is really supported by the ways in which Indigenous ceremonial practices have been a really big part of my life. And so all of those things are kind of connected very beautifully in the way that I show up in all of my spaces.
So
I think that answered your question.
It did. For those of our listeners who are not familiar with the work that you do, can you share, some of the things that you do? I know Pooja and I are very familiar with your work, but for those who are not, if you can share that with our listeners.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've done quite a bit of work in different communities, right? Again, I identify as an Indigenous Two-Spirit person, and that's a term that I kind of encompassed when I was in my mid-20s, right? So I identify as a queer person, as Two-Spirit Indigenous person. So I've done a lot of advocacy within like LGBTQ, Two-Spirit, like BIPOC queer community spaces. Has been a really big place that I've done a lot of advocacy, mostly in being in community for my own self, right? Of like, okay, where do I find my healing? And oftentimes that's in community. So I've done a lot of kind of work in advocacy in that arena. Currently, I do a lot of work in domestic violence. So that tends to be really a common theme throughout my my journey in advocacy has been in understanding, based on my own lived experience, language defined around domestic violence and explanations of what that means and how does that show up in our families. And, I was raised in a matriarchal family. And so the way in which survival from violence has showed up has influenced my work. So my current work, I do a lot of current work right now in domestic violence and power and control dynamics, with the overlap of how does domestic violence intertwine and interweave with additional forms of oppression. So that's really my big work now, in the work that I do in the state of Colorado and nationally. So you'll hear me reference a lot about domestic violence and power and control in a lot of different ways. But and then I worked, within the systems. All of the systems are connected, and so oftentimes the systems that I've worked within has been because I wanted to know more about how to navigate them, and I had the privilege and opportunity to be able to be in those spaces. And I know a lot of people don't. And so, I worked a little bit in child protective services because I was working in the world of domestic violence, and I saw that the overlap between DV survivors and child protective services is exponential.
Yeah.
And so I began working in that field to be able to better understand how to navigate people within that system and how to better understand and have language to be able to navigate those things. So I've worked in trauma basically for most of my adult professional life, is really just kind of a way to understand and give language to the things that, I experience in a lot of ways. So trauma and healing, right? And how are those things interconnected? So those have been some of the areas that I do work and focus.
And we also know that, when it comes to child protective services, children from, Black and brown families are often the ones who go through that system and re-traumatize by going through that system. Yeah. And I that's across the United States.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, it is. A lot of the work that I do, I realize now, when we're talking about power and control, because power and control overlaps all of them.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Mm-hmm. So, when people are like, I don't understand when we're talking about, child protective services, or we're talking about domestic violence, or we're talking about whatever, I don't understand why we're talking about power and control, because, I don't understand how all these things are connected. They're connected by power and control. Mm-hmm. Right. And so if we can talk about power and control, then we can talk about how that shows up in all of these spaces. And it helps us gain language, common language, and understanding that we may not fully have experience with, right? So when it comes to the child protective services, we have to understand historically why oftentimes these systems were created, and why they were created, and who were they created by, and who gets to, write the narrative, and who gets to write the policies and procedures, all these things, right? Yes. And then who gets impacted, right? And oftentimes it is predominantly, Black, brown kiddos, who are funneled into these systems, and further traumatized in a lot of different ways, right? So yes, it is definitely something that we need to continue having conversations about and understanding about, because I feel like there's such a disconnect about how these things and why these things were created and where we are now, right? And we can't fully understand those things unless we have that conversation.
Yeah, that is actually something that's personal to me, because currently my husband and I are going through pre-adoptive, and we are trying to adopt through the system. So they're not necessarily like a baby, and we're open to age range up to 16 years old. And, asking the social worker that's working with us, the demographics of kiddos that go through the system, and the trauma that a lot of these kiddos go through, and just some of the languages that's used. There's a lot of stigma.
Yeah.
I'm a family therapist, and I've worked with children who were in the foster care system and all that comes with that. So I just want to say thank you so much for the work that you do for both these communities, because you're absolutely right. There is a lot of power dynamics in play, and then you throw in like lack of resources and not access to like culturally like sensitive care and things like that. And it's like, what do they do, right? Like where do these communities go? So I'm curious to understand what exactly does your advocacy work look like at the domestic violence work that you're doing, and previously, like I know you're not with CPS anymore, but when you were with CPS, what does that look like? What did advocacy look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So advocacy currently for me in my current role. So I work at a coalition, a domestic violence coalition. So one, it's different, right? It holds a different level of systemic privilege because I'm not currently doing one-on-one advocacy with survivors, which has been my previous work, right? But we know that based on that work is hard work, right? That work is emotional work, it's spiritual work, it's like all of the things. And so I really, really got burnt out from it, and it impacts our bodies, right? I think we need to really understand how oftentimes the work that we do in our communities, when there's a lot of overlapping complex trauma, then the impact can oftentimes show up in our own bodies. And so, I transitioned out of kind of that one-on-one individual work as a way to heal my body. And so I transitioned to coalition work, which I love coalition work because it is more entrenched in a system. And what I love about this is it's disconnected in a way that we create kind of our own curriculum. We create our own curriculum. We create our own ways in which we get to kind of support communities and survivors, but we also get to teach on a systemic level. So what I currently do in my role is I work both state and nationally to be able to provide trainings on how power and control shows up with overlapping forms of oppression, because it's often not something that we talked about. And then from there, how do we understand it in a historical context like we talked about earlier? But then how do we review our policies and protocols and those types of things to be able to create better systems to support the people who we're working with, right? Because oftentimes it's the systemic levels that people get re-traumatized. And so being able to create those spaces, and really I take a lot of the influence that I've done with survivors individually. So I worked at a domestic violence shelter for a really long time, probably about 7 years. Wow. And, it's interesting because I tell people like I loved it, which is a weird thing, right? Because it's like DV, but I loved it because it was a communal setting and it was communal living, and the beauty that people find in connectivity and community can be just exponentially healing, right? And so a lot of the work that I did in the shelter was advocacy work. I started as a volunteer. I transitioned to a crisis line manager, and then I transitioned into the shelter program director, and I loved it. And also what I loved about it is I was a queer two-spirit leader in the community. And so inherently that brought a different type of connectedness and safety to the work that we were doing. And so by the time I had transitioned out of there, I had almost all queer staff, predominantly staff of color. We were seeing a higher rate of folks in the LGBTQ community as survivors coming into our program, a higher rate of communities of color coming into our program. And we were able to provide such a different type of support that was different than what was being created before.
And still is different.
Yeah.
What types of support were provided that's different from the original type of support?
I would say that there was a different level of cultural responsiveness that we were able to provide because we had folks with lived experiences who were doing the advocacy work. There was a different level of understanding of homeless resources because I had an advocate who had been, unhoused for many, many years. And so they were able to talk with folks about, here's where I found my food. Here's where I did, we had those connections made in a lot different ways than before. We had more Spanish-speaking advocates. We had more like all of those different pieces of it. But then not only that, we were more connected to the house physically, right? So we were out in the space. We were putting up artwork that reflected different communities, and we were doing all of these things that really created just a different atmosphere and different space for people to be able to do that. And then we expanded our advocacy resources, right? What communities do we need to connect with? What communities haven't we been connecting with? What could that look like? How do we meet people where they're at instead of them coming to us, because we know that the barriers that creates, right? We were exiting less people from our programming because there was more understanding that oftentimes people who we don't want in our services end up predominantly being, folks of color, right? Because oftentimes people are afraid of their anger and afraid of their communication style, and they don't understand it. And so instead of kind of creating the wraparound support, the answer is, let's not have them in our services, right? So we were creating longevity for people to be in our services because we had a more nuanced understanding of how trauma shows up for people.
That's so important because I've worked for, I'm a clinician and I've worked for years in community mental health, like for nonprofits and at the county as well. And we know how, okay, time is up with the contract. Okay, now we have to refer you somewhere else. And it's so inspiring to kind of see in your leadership how you've it's all about systems, right? So you like not only in your leadership, you've kind of changed that in the clinic the shelter that the DB work that you've done, like while you were directing that place. And also like policy is so important. And if any change has to happen, it has to happen at that coalition level, and lived experience is so important. So I'm just like amazed to see like your different avenues that you like your journey has taken you. And earlier you spoke about how you're like a visual person, and it's really hard to like kind of translate some of that into these experiences. And into, especially like I feel like in the academic way or like an educator way. And I'm so grateful that you're doing what you're doing, because it's these experiences that we need that really kind of is shaping the future of where we need to go and what really needs to be done. And I feel like most of us coming from like minoritized like communities in these spaces, they're also like a little off us, right? Like whether it's in like leadership or like at a director level and things like that. So I just really want to say thank you for everything that you've done. So
thank you.
And you've also mentioned the term Two-Spirit. Now, I know that Pooja and I are familiar with that term, but not many folks are. And I know that for different groups that, it's not encompassing, there's no one definition really. So I just wanted to give space to kind of, I guess, educate to our listeners who are not familiar with the term.
Yeah, absolutely. So Two-Spirit, so oftentimes you'll see the acronyms, right? The acronyms are very long, and the acronyms are also not encompassing, right, in full. So it's important to note that the language has limitations, especially when we're talking about language that's a colonial language and a very binary language, right? So so within the acronym, you oftentimes see LGBTQ, LGBTQ plus, LGBTQ2S. The 2S is the Two-Spirit. So I know that seems to be something that's a little bit newer. So folks to be able to reference that 2S is oftentimes that. So Two-Spirit is a term that was created and reclaimed in some ways in the 90s because a lot of Indigenous communities pre-colonization had a name or had communities and had an understanding that there were multiple genders. There wasn't this binary like example and thought processes that we currently exist in today. So much of our language and so much of our understanding of gender and sexuality are in binaries. And so it's hard to explain to folks that pre-colonization, those things didn't exist, right? So there may have been roles, but the roles weren't situated in patriarchal values, right? So the roles weren't like situated in positions of power and control, right? There's this understanding of, fluidity and relationship to things. And so same thing with, gender and sexuality. So a lot of Indigenous communities did have names and did have communities for what we now call Two-Spirit. So there were multiple different genders, there were multiple different sexualities, and oftentimes those folks who held those experiences were the healers. They were the folks that were the teachers. They took in the children that needed to be cared for, right? They were highly, highly, revered as these very, very powerful people because they had the ability to exist in multiple worlds, in worlds that, people who didn't identify that way didn't. And so it was, they were very, very powerful people in the community. And so unfortunately, due to colonization, because colonization has such a lens and is built so much into like religion and the church and some of those pieces, there was that separation of and that implementation of power and control within genders. And so during colonization, Two-Spirit folks were targeted specifically because they didn't fit the model of the settlers' understanding of what it meant to be man and woman, what it meant to be in power and subordinate, and like all of these things that we know about. And so the Two-Spirit leaders and the Two-Spirit communities were targeted for genocide specifically as a way to remove them from the communities, right? And so again, at the time, they didn't use the term Two-Spirit, but in the 90s, a lot of Indigenous communities were having a hard time finding what felt, true to their own experiences as Indigenous cultures, Indigenous communities. And so they adopted the term Two-Spirit. And the understanding really is that we have both, masculine and feminine. And there's so much intertwined in that. There's so much, their energies, their spirits, their entities. They're not, as we think of in Western culture. And so Two-Spirit is kind of this idea that those things could be fluid in a lot of different ways. And that shows up for people in a lot of complex ways. And so for me, I can speak for my experience with that term, and my relationship with that term is I do feel that there are, masculine and feminine energies that kind of intertwine within me in a lot of ways that don't fit the binary. And so, it doesn't necessarily say anything about my sexuality, right? It's important to kind of separate out those two, but it really is about how I exist within the world and how that shows up within my thinking and the ways that I show up in spaces as well. Right. So as a Two-Spirit person, oftentimes, I can show up in Indigenous communities in a very beautifully held space that I can't find in, my everyday walking down the streets or existing in, spaces that we currently have.
In colonizer spaces.
In colonizer spaces, exactly. Exactly.
Thank you for educating us also and our listeners with what you shared. And that's a really beautiful mug that you've have been holding. I noticed it earlier when you were drinking from it too. It's really beautiful.
Did you make that?
I did not. Oh, I can't see it with my background on, but I didn't. I bought it from this local store here. But what I love about it is it feels like clay, right?
It looks like it is clay. It's clay, right?
Yeah, it's clay.
Yeah.
But the outside is not finished with a gloss, right?
Yeah.
So it's rough, but it has cactus.
I like that.
Cute. Yeah, me and Dr. Felipe both have one, so we have a copy in it often.
Yeah, even in my culture, they make a lot of stuff with clay actually, because especially in the summertime and stuff, you have clay pots and you store water in it because it naturally makes it cold. Yeah, and even Dr. Donna loves chai, so they also serve chai in clay.
I love it.
Yeah, I love tea, but not the colonizer tea.
We had gone for an Asian American psychology association meeting, like
the
retreat.
Yeah.
And it was happening in some other city, and Dr. Donna was like, can you please bring chai and make it for me there? And I brought the whole thing, and everyone's looking at me like, what's going on?
It was a ritual, the way that you had to make it. You had
really
to do it specifically. Yeah.
But sorry, I kind of went off topic, but going back to what you said, I don't know, the terminologies in Sanskrit, but when you spoke about different kind of energies, that really resonated with me, because that's prevalent in my culture too. And it also made me really think about just indigenous culture, or people from different communities, even just the energies in the cosmos. If you really pay attention to it, right? The energy of the sun, the energy of the moon, and when the eclipse happens, it's all different energies that hold different kind of energies, and each of them has its purpose too. So when you said all of that, it kind of made me think also about just the universe.
The connectedness and the relationship to things, right?
Yeah,
is crucial. And then in the white supremacy culture that we live in, the intentionality of that is disconnectedness, right? Disconnectedness to the things around us, to the people, and so it's something that is so missed in a lot of ways, because I'm oh, look at the trees, we're in transition, how beautiful is this? I'm thinking of the roots, I'm thinking of all of these different things, right? And the connectedness to the things that we have just right around us, to the moon and the phases and the water that we hold in our body, and how that shifts when the moon changes, all of these things that we're just so far from in white supremacist culture, that we just
and no, you're absolutely right, because even earlier you spoke about the trauma, the trauma work that you've done, and how it gets translated into your body, and how we hold it, right? But it's we hold it as providers, but also our clients. But I feel Western psychology doesn't really focus on the energy aspect, right? It's thought, emotion, behavior, or oh, this is how it could show up physically, but not really understanding the spirit and the energy component of it. And many times in clinical practice, I'm often talking to my clients about the energy of the sun, the energy of the moon, and how you can use the energies of the cosmos to really cleanse your aura, right? And to not hold so much also in your body. So when you said all of that, it really resonated with me. And I know you've done, so you graduated from the University of Colorado Boulder, and you had degrees in Ethnic Studies and Sociology, and you focused on intergenerational resistance and complex trauma within Indigenous communities. And I don't want to butcher the other names, so can you please help me pronounce, how do I pronounce that?
The Xicanx.
Okay, Xicanx, Xicanx communities, thank you. So can you tell us more about your research and, the findings from your study, and whether you're still conducting research also?
Yeah, the research that I did in my undergrad really started with myself. So as mentioned earlier, oftentimes our journeys of folks who have complex, experiences and overlapping of oppression and violences in different ways, oftentimes the ability to access language or understanding can be really, really hard. And so, my effort to do that was an effort to break the generational silences within my own family, and to help gain a better understanding for me about why things were the way that they were in some ways, right? So again, I grew up in Boulder and Pueblo, so not too far from here, and predominantly by my mom, who was a single parent at the time. My father, uses substances and was an alcoholic, so he was in my life, but not super present in my life, right? But so I went oftentimes in between these two worlds, and they were very different worlds. And so I oftentimes saw a lot of domestic violence, right? A lot of, violence and domestic violence and child abuse and, poverty and all of these things that like are these generational historical pass down of trauma, right?
Mhm.
And also I was raised, like I had mentioned, in a matriarch. So predominantly my mom, my grandma, and my aunties. And I witnessed like the amazing, like resilience and strength that these women had. Right. And I began to like really think about the things about that passed down to me. Right. And so um I I needed better understanding and language on how to explain those things for myself. And so I began to do the research in my ethnic studies and sociology around, domestic violence, and ultimately what it turned into was complex trauma, right? Because it's all connected, and it wasn't just domestic violence. Like there was all of these other things, but I also wanted to witness it in the lens that I had experienced it, which wasn't a lens always of pain, right? It was also a lens of like beauty and vulnerability and comfort and resilience and like badassness, right? Of like just these moments of like these women are amazing and brilliant. And how do we capture those pieces of intersectionality and identity, right? Because I think oftentimes when we talk about intersectionality, we think about oppression. We think about like the impacts of colonization. We think about all of those things. And I try and shift the lens that like intersectionality is also where people find strength. It's where people find community. It's how people define resilience. It's how people find ceremony and all of those things, right? So if we can think about intersectionality not in the lens of oppression and think about it, then we can begin to create spaces that really support people in the healing that they need, because they're able to identify for themselves about the way that shows up, right? So that was kind of this confusion that I was having about like how do I negotiate this in my life? And so I started doing that research, and it really started with my own family. So I began doing research and began realizing that I identify as Xicanx. So much like Two-Spirit, it's a political term that was created during the 60s and 70s during the Xicana movement as a way to honor, people who lived in a certain part of the land, but were also disconnected to some of their indigenous roots, but still carried a lot of the indigenous practices, right? So I was having a hard time finding in books anything that reflect my own experiences, and I couldn't find, there was a lot on, indigenous experiences on reservations, and that just wasn't my family's experience, right? My family was put in the homes of colonizers to do work and labor. They weren't put on reservations. So, and that's often a history that's not talked about as much. And so I couldn't find my experiences. So I began to do my own research. And so in doing that, I created my honors thesis around interviewing my own family, because what I began to realize is that I had experienced domestic violence as a teenager, but had never told my mom about it. Right. And I know that my mom had experienced it, but she never fully told me about it. But like I was witnessing these things, but we don't talk about it. And so it was an effort to really break the silences intergenerationally. And so my honors thesis was then what Gloria Anzaldúa calls an autohistoria teoría, right? Like a telling of our own stories within our own family. And so I did interviews within my family to be able to begin to witness each other's stories and to be able to talk about the ways in which we found those beautiful moments of survival and how we pass those down to generations like me. And so that was kind of the hope for that piece. And what I learned is that it was really about complex trauma, right? My grandma talked a lot about the racism and violence that she had experienced within, the schools, and how she had to wash her hands to try and get the brown off, and how they were, all of these different pieces, are not able to go into the stores because it was signs that said, that they weren't allowed to. And that was not that long ago, right? Like it was very close history. And so that was the work that I did, was really an effort to put language to my own story and to begin doing the work within our family first, because that's oftentimes where it needs to start.
Yeah, and also with indigenous research, it's a lot of storytelling. a lot of oral history. And I know that kind of clashes with the traditional research methodologies. So I'm wondering if there was any pushback or maybe criticism that you experienced when you were going through this.
There was and there wasn't. So the beauty of being in ethnic studies is I had a lot of room to use, research methods that were not, traditionally what's, hoped for. And the way that I created my committee was also very intentional, right? So I wanted, because it was a storytelling, I also put in like poetry and like all of these different things in there. And so, there was pushback in that, like, I had to exist within the system and like meet certain requirements. And because I did it within ethnic studies, there was a lot more understanding of the different ways in which we storytell. And then the person that was on the sociology, committee that I had on my committee was really kind of supportive and understanding about what that means for me and why that's important. So I didn't get as much pushback as other folks probably
so
have.
lucky.
Yeah.
I know in psychology we more than likely would have pushback, huh, Pooja?
At all levels, right? Like advocacy, academia, the way
Clinical.
it intersects. But going back to kind of what you said, thank you for sharing like the work that you've done with your research. And that is so powerful because you're absolutely right. Intersectionality, the way it's spoken about in academia or in different roles that we have in the work that we do, is all about oppression. And like I'm taking a advanced clinical like spirituality class right now in my PhD program, and all the articles or everything that was kind of given to us in the reading material just only talks about how spirituality has been oppressive to people, right? And while that's true to some extent, in my line of clinical work, it has not, right? Also, and it has been a source of strength. And we don't see that in the literature. We don't see how people use this as a source of like resilience, and even with like pain and suffering, right? In many cultures, especially the communities of color, we find meaning, we seek meaning, or we find community. So it's very powerful that you held space for both of those things, and really wanted to also like highlight that. And the fact that you said that, like certain things within your family, like you hadn't shared with your mom, or like there's certain things that like your mom hadn't shared with you. And I think in communities of color, like especially like generationally, we learn through storytelling, or we learn through just having conversations. And I feel, I guess what I'm trying to also ask was there a lot of healing also and like learning that kind of happened just within your like family system? Because what you said was it starts with your system. So that really like resonated with me.
There was a lot of healing. There was also a lot of pain, right? I think what I didn't anticipate, which I really had to get into the nuance of power and control and positionalities of power, right? And the ebb and flow of how that shows up within our own systems. Because what was interesting for me was that, I was really close to my grandma, but as I began to interview both my grandma and my mom, I began to realize and learn that like my grandma was also a great source of pain for my mom. Right. And so how have we existed within these relationships that are both like beautiful and painful, and where did that come from?
Yeah.
Right. And so then beginning to really kind of entangle those pieces, and why did my grandma show up in abusive ways to my mom? Right. And how was my great grandma? So I began to really also notice a lot of ways that abusive behaviors showed up in some of the women in my family, which is not what I had anticipated. Right.
Yeah.
It kind of, it pushed me to really think outside of my understanding of survivorship, right, and violence. But then also really question, how does power play into this, and positionality of power and what that means? And, how my great grandma was didn't speak English, right? We imagine her as like this angry woman, but she didn't speak English. She had 15 children. My grandpa, Lord knows, I adore him, and at the same time, like, I'm sure it was very difficult, right? And so, my auntie talked about her mom as like this very harmful person. And so then let's analyze how that harm shows up and why it's there and what that means, and how oftentimes, there's this adoption of, abusive behavior in an effort to survive, and how that is radiated onto our children, and what does that mean, and how do we break that, right? So it really created, like, in a lot of ways, more questions about how these things show up. And we were really also able to identify the ways in which my grandma then taught my mom, like, these survival pieces, and then how generationally then my mom taught me in a lot of different ways something completely different that now I'm teaching my children in very different, right? So really looking at the generational shifts that happen, and then how a lot of the colonization and violence that the older generations experienced kind of created some of these spaces where the impact was also on their children, right? And so it was very complex, and it created a lot of questions, and also helped us tell a lot of stories that had never been told.
Yeah. And I also feel like questions, lots of questions do arise, but it also gives like context, and especially like generationally, right? Trying to figure out those patterns, trying to figure out those themes, and trying to really assess what needs to be done differently, or what can we still retain.
Yeah.
So we'd like to kind of switch gears, and I'll let Dr. Donna ask you more about Yolia Creations and your art and your jewelry.
Ooh, yes. Which, by the way, that's a great reminder for me, because I need to get a few. So yeah, tell us a little bit more about Yolia, and why Yolia? What is the significance behind that name?
Yeah. So Yolia Creations, I started, when did I start that? Probably in about 2018, 2019. So a little bit before pandemic started. And really, art is a way that I find healing. Art is a way that I find healing. It's a way that I find community. And so it really stemmed from that. But I was also transitioning out of being in the shelter for a really long time. And the beauty that I had found in the community, and how language can hold such power in such a beautiful way, really kind of influenced me into creating Yolia Creations, right? Because a lot of what I had witnessed being in the shelter was just such strength. And so I wanted to be able to have an outlet for that. And leather work, my brother had started doing leather work, and I began to like witness him. My family is very creative. My family is a very creative family. They do a lot of creative things. And so, I saw my brother doing leather work, and so I decided to try it. And I began making earrings. And the earrings had powerful statements on them, right? So it might be decolonize, it might be sin fronteras, it might be, queer AF, whatever that was, but really as an effort to like reclaim a lot of those very powerful intersectionalities that we have and that we hold and that we exist within, because language holds power, and oftentimes that was used against a lot of communities. And so how do we kind of reclaim those for ourselves within, but then radiate that out as well? And so Yolia Creations was my way of healing from the trauma that I had experienced, the vicarious trauma and the secondary trauma that I had experienced within the work that I was doing, but also was a way for me to, use my hands and just be creative. And so that's when it started. I did not anticipate or expect it to go the way that it went. And it was, I went into it with this like idea of like, oh, I'm going to just do this thing that just helps create healing. And then it really kind of went in this direction of so many connections, right? And so many community connections, to the point where then, by the time I started making them, I had put a map because I wanted to visually see all of the places that Yolia was going and all the different communities. And it was like so many places, so far away. And it was so beautiful to see, like, oh my goodness, the ways in which community can be connected
What was the
through
furthest?
something like art. What was the furthest? Oh, there was a point in my map where I had like a string all the way out. I might have to grab my map at some point. I don't recall in this moment, but I just remember seeing like these strings going all the way across. And it was just amazing. And I got to meet so many people. And I think that's where I started. I started at my first booth ever was influenced by my old supervisor. And we started at a conference, a domestic violence conference. And what I loved about it is people were gravitating towards the table and sharing their stories, which was the point, right? Like the point for me is, how do we become witness to each other's stories? Because that is how we fill the gaps that have been erased in history. That is how we, create connectedness and healing within our communities. And so people were coming to the table and like crying and telling me their stories and holding these pieces. And it was just beautiful to witness. And so then I started doing shows every month, actually. I was very, very busy. And so I met so many community, which was a beauty in it that I had hoped for, but didn't expect in a lot of ways. And because of my identities and my lived experiences, that expanded over, being in Out Front magazine here in, the local area and getting interviewed by different people. Because they also wanted to witness my story, right? So just like these ripple effects that I hadn't anticipated. But so Yolia is a Nahuatl word, which is an indigenous language pre-colonization. And so Yoli means heart. And so what I appreciated about it is I was sitting with my son at the time and we were trying to think of like, what am I going to name this business? I don't even know what to name it. And so I was reading through one of my books and Yolia came up. So it's like spirit, it's soul. Yolia means heart. And so heart, but also the pieces that come with it. So movement, breath, life, reviving. And so that is Yolia, right? It is the soul, it is the spirit, it is the heart. It exists in life and in the spirit world. It is movement like the drum of the heart, right? Oftentimes when we're in ceremony, we're using the drum and we talk about how that's the heartbeat, right? So all of those things were connected. And at the time that was really where I wanted to go, right? Was this effort to like reconnect, to be in movement, to acknowledge kind of the healing and the recreation and reviving of like this new journey. And so then it became Yolia Creations.
Love it.
Do you still like do booths and like do things like publicly, or is it all like online right now?
I'm starting to do them again. I had stopped for a really long time. And then I would say the past 6 months, I've started to sign up and kind of do the things. Dr. Felipe, my partner, Dr. Felipe, it was really hard on my hands at first because I did them all by hand. And so they went and got me a big like tool that I could use that like stamps them out. And so I can like bust them out super quick now, which is way different than before. And then I get to spend more time like actually, stamping them individually and all those things. So I am beginning to do more.
It's beautiful. And like, obviously I'm going to share like your links in the show description because our listeners should really take a look at your work and also like buy it, because it really has that social justice aspect of it, right? And the language that you use. Like I've won so I have 2 pairs, the Decolonize and Black Lives Matter, and I've won the Decolonize, both of them like frequently to school a lot. And I think I don't want to butcher it, but I think like another one that I wanted to buy and like I'm not is I'm my ancestors' wildest dreams. Like that is also like so beautiful. But yeah, like I can see the craftsmanship in it, and it, I mean, even like Dr. Felipe would also kind of post stuff like while you were like making it, like during the pandemic and things like that, and it's a lot of hard work, and I like that it also gives you so much healing in making that too. So thank you for putting that out there.
Yeah, the creation of them is ceremony, right? And really connectivity is the goal. And with the Black Lives Matter one, that I've found ways to be able to connect with community, right? So as, someone who doesn't hold the identity, of being Black in America, like I wanted to be able to also connect with communities that I could support. So those ones specifically, I connected with this amazing youth organization. And so 75% of the proceeds of those ones go to that organization, right? Wonderful. And so Yolia has also allowed me the opportunity to connect with communities in such awesome ways, and also be able to spread the word about, how are we often all doing this, and how do we support each other, and what does that mean? And so I love that you have, those earrings, and they mean so much to me. And when I see people out like randomly wearing them, I'm like, oh, look at that. You look so amazing and badass. And like, I love it. Yeah. So thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah, no, and that's the whole reason, like, why I also kind of wanted to have you here. Like, even before, like, even while we were like in season 1, and we had not even recorded episodes for season 1, I was telling Dr. Donna, I was like, we need to have you on. And from like last year, it's always been like something where I was like, I want to hear your story, because our whole goal of our podcast is, how do we highlight your work, and how do we highlight, I mean, not highlight, but like also we want to hear your story. And like, that's what's missing in this world. And that's what's missing in this field of academia that we're part of, and leadership also that we're part of, and this lack of community that kind of does not exist.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And the ability then for us to connect, right? Like this connection, otherwise through art and creativity, because even you all, right? You all create, how do we create spaces for each other?
Yeah.
Right.
To be witness to each other, right? And you all are doing the same thing. You all are creating a space to be witness to people and to be witness to their stories in the same way that, I am as Yolia Creations. And so the healing that does across communities is so powerful and so needed.
Yeah. So like earlier, like when we started, right? And I couldn't say it at that moment. And like, I realized I didn't answer that question, but you were like, are we recording this audio and video? And the reason why I was also like so persistent on us recording video format is to also put a face behind, that voice, and also just to be able to connect with that person too, like while you're hearing their story. And so that's why I also, like from the beginning, I was like, no, we're doing audio and video. So we do have like 2 more questions left for you.
Sure.
And what are the steps we need in our society and communities to see more cross-racial ethnic solidarity, to be better accomplices, for the Indigenous and queer community?
I would say, one, a lot of my story has talked about starting from within, right? I think that we really need to have an understanding about our social locations and our positionality in order to engage in such a wider context conversation, right? Because we bring so much to the things the interactions that we have on a day-to-day basis. And so it definitely needs to start there, right? With our positionalities and our thought processes and all of those pieces. And then from there, begin understanding, like I had mentioned, what does our positionality to power look like? Because we exist within a context where, power is very important in a colonial mindset, right? And so we need to understand the ebb and flow of that shift and how we all show up in those spaces, because we all have shifting positions of power. And so being able to have an understanding at the core of some of those pieces my kiddo right now is learning about paradigm shifts. So she's talking about paradigm shifts like every day. And so the importance of understanding that paradigm shifts are going to be important to have, right? Like I have no idea what's going on in your world, but I know that there's going to be common themes and overlaps that happen at that time, that build connection, but also are different perspectives and different ways in which we approach things. And so really beginning the foundations of those. And then how do we look at intersectionality as a beautiful thing? How do we really bring that and create spaces that are intentional, that we understand our impact that we have, but are really intentional to create, uncomfortable but safer places for people to be able to be their full authentic selves, and to be able to bring in their tea that they need, right? And to be able to bring in their altar that they need, and to be able to, and have an understanding that that's important for people, right? To be able to do and create spaces where that's an opportunity to be able to do that. Because when we begin building in that way, it really creates so much better of connection for communities, because if we don't understand where we've been and how colonization has impacted Indigenous queer communities or communities of color, then we're not going to be able to think critically about how we can do something different, right? We're not going to be able to look at our systems and say, hey, this has to change. Rule reduction is important within our systems. Understanding why somebody might use substances, understanding why, like, all these different complexities of how trauma and resilience and healing shows up in our communities is really important. So it's really broad, like, right? Sometimes I answer very big and like in a big lens, and in some ways that tends to be where we need to start, right?
Right.
Because when we can understand, like, begin with our personhood first and our positions to power and understanding of that, we can then understand it within community contexts, and then community contexts support systemic change, right? So how do we create that ripple effect very intentionally? And some of our systems need to go, right?
Yeah,
some of them need to go.
And
Yes.
it's, and like, I don't mean to say this in a bad way, but just in my experience in life on this planet, and in like different positions I've held, like as a student, as a clinician, as a leader, like it really starts with you. And I feel like people don't realize that, people don't understand that, and they want to try blaming the system or blaming other people. And it's like, hey, like, you first need to really assess this for yourself. And people even older than me, like in leadership positions, where they've just really not done the work. And it's like, you're talking about community, you're talking about all these things, but it's like, how do you create change within yourself first, and then that translates into that ripple effect? And
right,
yes,
like, even when, like, we give DEI talks or presentations at conferences or like just workshops and things like that, we really do also say that, hey, it really starts with assessing yourself first, then going on to your community, and then from there figuring out, how can I show up for other people? How can I understand their experiences and be there? So yes, it's big, and I love how you broke it down and really explained it to us, because it is also simple to understand and to continue to do that work, and it's a lifelong process.
Oh yeah.
I recently went to this training about like the right use of power is what they're called, and it was very interesting, and I hadn't heard it in this context before, but they talked about the importance of like personal power, role power, like systemic power, like the different places of power, and how fragility is created when there is a low connection to personal power. Right. And so oftentimes we have these systems where people are they find their role power in their systems, right? My work, my, these systemic pieces, which is also where we find white supremacy, right? Like my identity is intertwined with the ways that I show up and the productivity that I have at my work. And so, but then there's also a low connection to what is my personal power, right? Like personal power, not in the context of like, oppression, but personal power in the context of like, what do I bring to this conversation? Who am I as a person, right? Like all of those things. And so fragility is created when there's low connections to personal power, right? So then we have these where we're unable to then move up into these systems and have these really complex conversations because there's not an understanding of the personal power that people hold when they're so connected only to systemic power and role power within their organization. And I was like, that is very true. But people who have had experiences of, oppression and systemic barriers and complex trauma oftentimes start with their personal power because that is how they've survived. That is what they've been taught generationally. And so they have a very strong roots in their personal power. And so that can be very intimidating then when we're challenging people who have a very strong connection to their role power in like a capitalist society, right?
Yeah.
I love that. Well put.
Yeah. And I like how you also spoke about like fragility, because when we hear the word fragility, generally, like we hear like white fragility, but I completely disagree with that because it exists within like brown and Black communities also. And I really appreciate you like naming that. And, earlier you said you're doing like coalition work and that's your privilege, right? But it's also what you're doing with that power and privilege that kind of like circles back to kind of exactly like what you're saying right now. So thank you. And our last question for you is, what advice do you have for the younger generation? So if you could meet your younger self, what advice would you give yourself?
I would say that, the quote that I started with earlier was very powerful. Like when you know who you are, you know what to do. You have so much within you already that is beautiful and growing and rooted, and start there, and, things ebb and flow and shift, and it's important to understand that. But so much of our, youth and our younger selves just need to be held in ways that we hadn't been taught to be held, right? That I'm now learning as an adult. And so when I talk with my kiddo, I'm like, how do we hold your righteous anger like a beautiful thing? How do we hold your joy as like this beautiful thing? And being able to really kind of honor those pieces because they are our future generations. They're future generations. They are our future ancestors. And there is so much, beauty in that.
Beautiful.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for making time for us. And I hope I get to see you like not briefly run into you, but like I hope I get to see you actually in person again. And the reason I asked you earlier, like, do you still do like booths and things like that? Because I really hope at the Asian American like conference that they're gonna happen, if you do attend, or I really hope that we could have a booth for like your jewelry, because
that's a great idea.
Yeah, because it is so important, and especially in that space to bring community and to kind of model that and to show that, and so when that happens, I'll let Dr. Donna contact you with that.
I would love that. I
love it. And please give my love to Mare Lu.
I will.
Even please let Dr. Felipe know I also say hi.
And thank you so much for, being gracious enough with your time and with your wisdom and your knowledge. And thank you so much. I don't know. Thank you. I'm just so giddy and so happy that I get to finally talk to you, even though it's virtual.
I like, even through the Zoom call, like I can just feel like you have just such beautiful energy, and your aura just like radiates through just everything that you do. So thank you.
Of course. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to our podcast today. We hope you enjoyed the episode. For more information about today's guests and their social media links, you can click on the description links of the episode. Pooja Mami Dana and Dr. Donna Demanarig host this podcast. Our podcast team includes our podcast interns, Alexis Rios from the University of North Texas in Denton, Texas, and Petra Zadroga from Wheaton College in Norton, Massachusetts. We also want to acknowledge our production team, David DeVito and Rachel Sheffer.
If you would like to know more about us or to watch video clips of this interview, then follow us on Instagram at APADiv45_Presidential Task Force, on TikTok and X at APADiv45_Coakley, or on YouTube and Facebook at Dr. Kevin Coakley's APA Division 45 Presidential Task Force.
Strength and solidarity. There's strength and solidarity.